At the bustling airport, a 38-year-old single mother walked up to the check-in counter with a first-class ticket in hand and a $1 million contract tucked inside her leather handbag. But instead of receiving the respect that comes with being a senior strategic partner, she was scrutinized from head to toe by a biased female employee, as if she had mistakenly entered a world not meant for her. "This lane is for first-class passengers." The words weren't just a mistake. They were an insult disguised as protocol. No one there knew that just minutes later, the woman they intended to push out of the first class would freeze Horizon Air's entire network, force senior executives out of their meetings, and make the service industry take a hard look at itself in shame. Because when you dare to belittle a black woman simply because she doesn't wear the brand you're used to seeing, you're not just wrong, you're shooting yourself in the heart of your own business. And the most ruthless part? She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to sue. She just needed one phone call. Follow the real story that forced an entire power system to bow down to the woman they once disrespected. Before the sun had fully risen, Celeste Morgan entered the check-in area at Gate 17 of JFK International Airport. Her dark brown high heels tapped lightly on the marble floor, each step firm and unhurried. Her tailored black suit, paired with an olive silk scarf around her neck, made her appear both dignified and simple. At 38, Celeste was the CEO of Morgan Fresh Systems and a single mother, having traveled longer roads than most could imagine. But this morning she carried no stories. She only carried a first-class ticket and a speech prepared for the Western Food Sustainability Summit in San Francisco. In her hand, she held an old yet polished brown leather bag, a gift from her son, saved up for her 50th birthday. In the other, her first-class boarding pass clearly read, Celeste Morgan, Flight 218, Seat 1, A, JFK to SFO, First Class. The waiting area was still quiet. A few scattered passengers stood sipping coffee, pulling their bags behind them, eyes still heavy with sleep. Celeste walked straight to the check-in counter, nodding politely at Haley Dorsey, the young white woman manning the counter, dressed in Horizon Air's dark blue uniform. "Good morning," Celeste said softly and politely, handing over her ticket. Haley took it, quickly scanning the name printed on the ticket, but then she paused. A quick glance followed by a longer one, the kind of look Celeste was all too familiar with, one of measuring, judging, and suspicion. Haley raised an eyebrow. She looked at the ticket again, then back at Celeste. No greeting, no smile. She spoke, her tone not loud but cold enough to cut through the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. "This lane is for first-class passengers, ma'am." Celeste didn't blink. She didn't smile. There was no need to smile. She stood tall, locked her eyes with Haley's, and responded in a calm, confident voice without a hint of irritation. "I know." In that moment, anyone standing nearby might have felt a thin chill pass over Haley's back. Not from the weather, but from the spirit of a woman who had lived her life being doubted, but had never once bowed her head to prejudice. Haley didn't smile in return. She didn't immediately scan the ticket. Her hand hesitated. Her eyes were still fixed on the black woman in front of her, as if waiting for another piece of evidence to confirm that this was a mistake. What no one knew was that the woman being scrutinized wasn't just a passenger. She was the person behind the largest clean food supply system Horizon Air had ever contracted with. But this morning, standing in front of a girl just transferred from Tulsa to JFK, that didn't matter. All Haley saw was a black woman wearing expensive clothes holding a first-class ticket, and in her eyes that didn't fit. That was all it took. And thus began the subtle yet soon-to-be overwhelming wave that would bring an entire airline to a halt. Haley stood frozen, holding the ticket but not moving to scan it. Several seconds passed in awkward silence. Then, as if she had just realized something needed to be done, she leaned over slightly, glancing quickly toward the back of the counter, where a security officer in a dark uniform stood near the luggage scanner. Her movement wasn't large, but it was intentional. Haley Dorsey, who had only been transferred from Tulsa to JFK a little over 3 weeks ago, was still trying to make a good impression with her superiors. In internal meetings, she often heard about the importance of maintaining safety and VIP passenger standards, especially at major airports like New York. But what she had never been trained to do was recognize a racially discriminatory response when it hides behind the guise of check-in procedures. "I need to see your ID," Haley said, trying to maintain calm, but her eyes betrayed her caution. Celeste tilted her head slightly. Her dark eyes seemed to pierce through the empty space between the words, between the lack of reason and the unease that Haley was struggling to conceal. She didn't speak, simply reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out her Ohio driver's license, placing it neatly on the counter without saying a word. Haley took the ID, hesitated for a beat, then did nothing. She didn't scan it. She didn't enter the name into the system. She just let it lie there as if it were enough to buy time. Then she stepped back 2 paces and whispered something into her radio. Not long after, a tall man in a Horizon security uniform appeared. He didn't ask questions. He didn't greet her. He just stood stiffly next to Celeste, his cold eyes studying her every move as if she were a potential threat. Celeste Morgan still didn't flinch. She didn't sigh. She didn't react. But inside, she knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't the first time. Years ago, in a luxury hotel in Dallas, she had been denied access to a conference area because she didn't have a membership card, even though she was the keynote speaker. She had also been stared at by a client during a meeting, just because he thought she was the secretary who brought the wrong papers. And today, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, holding a legitimate first-class ticket, she was being treated like an outsider who shouldn't be here. With her right hand still gripping the leather bag, Celeste pulled out her phone from her left pocket. She unlocked it, quickly searched through her contacts, and dialed. Only 2 rings. "Maggie, it's me. Pull up the contract with Horizon Air, the $48 million deal for the entire Western routes, signed less than 2 weeks ago. I'm standing at JFK, Gate 17. Looks like they need a reminder." On the other end of the line, Maggie Geller, Celeste's longtime executive assistant, didn't ask any further questions. She simply said, "I'm pulling up the file now. Do you want me to call Cynthia Reyes directly?" Celeste glanced quickly at Haley, who was now pretending to be busy with the computer screen. She replied briefly, "Not yet. Just flag the alert for now. I think they're about to realize the issue." She hung up. In her hand was still the unscanned first-class boarding pass. Beside her stood the security guard, standing like a statue. Behind her, passengers were starting to trickle in, whispering when they saw her being held up. What's going on? Did she do something? Maybe the ticket's fake. Celeste heard every word, but she didn't turn around. She just stood there as if waiting for an elevator, patiently, calmly. But in reality, every passing moment was shaking a massive system to its core, even though no one could see it yet. She didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to be in the right place at the right time. And that moment had just begun. Celeste's arm still gripped the handle of her leather bag as she stood at Gate 17, caught between the cold stare of the security guard and the obvious discomfort of Haley. But within her, everything felt strangely calm, as if her mind had transported back to a winter morning in Cleveland, Ohio, where every journey of growth began with the scent of fresh vegetables and her mother's hands always covered in dirt. Louise Morgan, her mother, had worked as a longtime employee at a small grocery store on Euclid Avenue. Her shift started at 4:30 a.m., but she never went alone. Celeste, as a 9-year-old girl, had always gone with her, still half asleep, her small hand clutching the corner of her mother's coat as they carried crates of apples, cabbage, and carrots from the truck to the shelves. No one talked about starting a business. No one dreamed of changing their lives. But from an early age, Celeste quietly observed how her mother interacted with each customer, not just through words, but through eye contact, sincerity, and patience. Each time a customer hesitated between 2 melons, Louise didn't say, "Just pick one." Instead, she would pick up both, gently tap the rind, sniff the aroma, and smile. "You should pick this one. It's sunnier today, so this melon will be sweeter." Celeste learned everything, not from books, but between the scent of melon and the brown earth. At 17, while her peers dreamed of Ivy League universities, Celeste chose to study at Kent State University, while also working part-time in a cold storage warehouse. When other kids complained about early mornings, she was already used to the sound of carts rolling over damp concrete floors. When she graduated with a degree in agricultural business, her only assets were $300 in savings, an old Ford, and an idea that no one dared to believe in: make clean, traceable produce the new standard for the entire food supply chain. She started with a roadside vegetable stand in suburban Akron, with a hand-painted sign reading, "Fresh every day, from farm to your hands in 24 hours. No one believed in that slogan, until they saw Celeste drive herself to pick up produce at 4 a.m., then personally sort each potato, each pepper in the afternoon. There were no employees, no investors, just willpower and an unshakable belief. But the real turning point came when she discovered a gap in the market: clean food with traceability, available in enough quantity to supply retail chains, but not as expensive as boutique food. While major companies were chasing high-priced organic food for the wealthy, Celeste focused on real food for the masses. She visited small farms across Ohio, spoke directly with farmers, and persuaded them to switch to GAP production standards. Then she set up a logistics system to get the products into supermarkets, schools, and even airlines. Many people had asked, why airlines? Celeste would reply, because first class is where standards are defined, and I want those standards to start with a clean carrot. Morgan Fresh Systems was founded in an old garage with just a laptop that often froze and a whiteboard covered in notes. But after 15 years, the company had become a supplier for 34 high-end supermarket chains, 5 university systems, and most recently, Horizon Air, an airline that had signed a $48 million contract to completely revamp their in-flight meal service. And yet today, at Gate 17, that woman was being suspected, asked to present her ID, held up under the gaze of an employee who neither understood nor fully appreciated her small, misplaced power. Because she was a woman, because she was black, because in Haley Dorsey's eyes, Celeste Morgan didn't look like the kind of person who flies first class. But what Haley didn't know was that in just a few minutes, this decision would shake an entire corporation to its core. The very woman, standing quietly at Gate 17, treated like a potential threat, was the one who had saved Horizon Air from one of the worst brand crises of the decade. Just 3 months ago, the airline's name was all over social media with images no one wanted to see. Frozen meals cracking, dry pasta like plastic packaging floating in aluminum trays. A first-class passenger, famous on TikTok, posted a video slamming an entire meal tray onto the table with the biting caption, "Fly thousands of dollars. Eat like you're in prison." In one night, Horizon became a media laughingstock. The headquarters in Minneapolis went into panic mode. The executive team held emergency meetings, and the communications team had to delete hundreds of negative comments every day. In the internal report, the brand management department succinctly wrote, "We don't just have a food problem, we have an image problem." And that's when Celeste Morgan's name came up in a private meeting. Not because she had a flashy advertising campaign, not because Morgan Fresh Systems had a grand office in Manhattan. In fact, her headquarters was still modestly located in an old industrial park in Dayton. But anyone who had ever worked with Celeste knew one thing. She didn't talk about making a difference. She created it, and let others realize it for themselves. When Horizon Air sent an offer to collaborate, Celeste didn't present a PowerPoint. She didn't boast about growth charts, didn't bring along a sales team or a CFO. In Horizon's 18th floor meeting room, she only brought a black and white printed proposal and a cloth bag full of samples. There were cherry tomatoes from a farm in Indiana, kale from the Ozark Mountains, whole grain bread made at a small production facility in Missouri. Each item was packaged in biodegradable materials. When she laid the samples on the conference table, one of Horizon's executives, a former chef, exclaimed, "Why does this smell so good? Is this a sample?" "No," Celeste smiled. "This is the real deal, the kind you'll use instead of those frozen, ice-covered trays." In the 37-page proposal, Celeste suggested a fresh altitude program, not only changing ingredients but overhauling the entire logistical ecosystem. A seasonal menu change every month, sourcing ingredients from farms near flight. Routes. No intermediaries. Signing directly with farmers to ensure minimum pricing and quality control. Fully biodegradable packaging, saving the airline nearly $1.2 million in waste disposal. Per year. Short shelf life, but high freshness, reducing customer meal returns by 41%. Less than a week later, Horizon signed a $48 million contract, covering the entire Western and Midwestern routes, with the option to expand into international routes if the initial phase was successful. But more importantly, Celeste didn't take any media rewards. When Horizon's internal communications proposed making a video to introduce the female CEO behind this meal revolution, she refused. "Don't put my face on the meal trays, I'm not a brand. The only thing that should be noticed is the quality on the customer's plate. But you're the leader, the inspiration. I'm the one raising a child with fresh vegetables and utility bills. Don't turn me into a role model. I'm just doing what I believe is necessary." And now, at Gate 17, after all of that, after saving the company from a media disaster, after rebuilding customer trust, she was being treated like someone unworthy of standing in the first-class line. No one at Horizon Air knew that. As she stood there, calm, not arguing, not shouting, she knew exactly what she was facing. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a system glitch. It was something far more dangerous, prejudice disguised as procedure. Inside the counter, Haley Dorsey was still pretending to search the screen. She knew there was no technical error. The name matched, the seat matched, the flight matched. But in her mind there was still something that didn't match. How could someone like her be sitting in seat 1A? Haley wasn't a bad person, but she was a product of a culture that had become too familiar with the successful model attached to white skin, neat hair, and a haughty attitude. Celeste didn't fit the mold of the VIP customer Haley had seen in the company's internal campaigns. And that's what led Haley to make the wrong assumption. A small mistake, but a mistake at the wrong time. and with the wrong person. At this very moment, Assistant Maggie Geller had finished pulling up the contract file and sent a copy to 3 people. Cynthia Reyes, Northeast Regional Director of Horizon. Jack Renault, Executive Director of Food and Customer Experience. Elise Stone, Head of Brand Crisis Management. In the email, there was only one short line. VIP guest, Celeste Morgan, being held at JFK Gate 17. $48 million contract. Suggest checking the cameras and reviewing the staff. 3 minutes later, Cynthia jumped out of her chair, leaving her steaming coffee and the marketing meeting behind. The name Celeste Morgan wasn't known to everyone, but to an executive like Cynthia, it was a name that could determine an entire financial season. And as Cynthia's footsteps echoed through the JFK Airport's upper floors, one thing had become certain. Celeste Morgan was no longer just a passenger waiting to board a flight. She had just become a silent earthquake, shaking an entire system. And as Celeste's high heels remained still by the entrance, her boarding pass still resting in Haley's hand, the silence began to echo. It wasn't the kind of comfortable silence you find among passengers waiting to board. It was a tense, uncomfortable silence, as though something wasn't right, and everyone could feel it. But no one spoke. The crowd behind Celeste began to grow. People scrolled on their phones, pulled their suitcases along, glancing toward the counter as if trying to figure out the reason for the delay. But after just a few seconds, the curious looks started turning into whispers. She's not leaving? Maybe she's trying to sneak into first class. Probably a fake ticket. A middle-aged man in a gray windbreaker, wearing Bluetooth earphones, leaned toward the woman next to him and whispered, as if gossiping. Another one who thinks just wearing a suit will get them to the front row. Celeste heard every word, but she didn't turn her head. She didn't furrow her brow. She was too familiar with this type of prejudice, the kind that never calls itself by name but always lingers like cold air seeping through concrete walls. She stood there, her back straight, her posture firm. Her gaze didn't avoid it, didn't shift away. She didn't need to explain, because in places where power is measured by white skin, a black woman speaking logically will immediately be labeled as troublesome. Inside the counter, Haley Dorsey still didn't know how to handle it. The screen in front of her showed no errors. The passenger's name matched, the seat was correct, the flight code was accurate. But in her mind, there was still something off, like ink that hadn't dried yet. Her reason knew Celeste had the right to board, but her emotions, the thing she wouldn't admit, were whispering into her ear. But she doesn't look like the kind of person I normally see in seat 1A. Haley didn't know that this not looking like thing she couldn't even express in words was the very essence of discrimination, an unspoken judgment that didn't need laws or paperwork. Just a look and silence. On the other side of the counter, the security guard still stood next to Celeste, saying nothing, but standing too close. She could feel his shadow partially covering her hand. He wasn't touching her, but his position made it clear she was being watched. And what about the people around her? No one intervened. No one asked what was happening. Instead, whispers began to take root. A blonde woman in a designer blazer whispered to her companion, "Probably booked the ticket with reward points. Horizon's getting too lenient lately." A young man standing near Celeste looked up and raised his phone to take a photo. No permission, no reason, just snapping it, like an instinct. Celeste didn't turn around, but her hand tightened slightly around the strap of her bag, not out of anger, but out of a deeper disappointment, a pain that people like her had learned to suppress again and again. In Dayton, when she first started signing contracts with the first supermarket, she had been stopped right at the door. Deliveries should be left at the back gate. You're in the wrong place." She didn't explain, just quietly circled around, signed the delivery slip, and left. In New Orleans, when she went into a watch store with her son, she was closely followed by the staff. When her son asked, "Mom, why is he following you?" she simply smiled, "Because I look like someone they think will steal." And today, amid an international airport, amid civilized words and modern procedures, the same old story repeated itself. Inside Horizon's system, the gears started turning. At the 10th floor operations office at JFK, Cynthia Reyes had just received a message from Maggie Geller with an attached document. Celeste Morgan is being held at Gate 17. You should come immediately. In Minneapolis, Jack Renault, executive director of food, was reviewing the email he had signed just 42 days ago with Morgan Fresh. He knew, if this became public, it wouldn't just harm the image. It would cause serious economic damage. Because Celeste wasn't just a supplier. She was the cornerstone of the upcoming Fresh Flight campaign. At Gate 17, Haley's colleague, Mia, started to feel something wasn't right. She walked over and asked quietly, "Haley, is there really an issue?" Haley whispered back, her eyes still on the screen. "I don't know. It's just something feels off. My instinct, that's all." Mia frowned. Instinct is not procedure. That sentence should have been enough to make Haley stop. But she didn't stop. She had gone too far to easily turn back. Admitting a mistake to the person she had misjudged was something many would rather move forward than confront. Amidst it all, Celeste Morgan still didn't say a word. But her gaze, the same gaze that had once looked directly into the eyes of dozens of CEOs in million-dollar negotiations, that had said no when pressured, that had stood firm through under-the-table deals, was still looking forward, calm, decisive, and unyielding. The pristine white plate, just touching the salmon salad, fell onto the conference table on the 16th floor of Horizon's headquarters in Minneapolis. Jack Renault, executive director of food and customer experience, froze as he read the email from Maggie Geller. Subject: Urgent, serious issue at Gate 17, JFK. Attachment: scanned copy of the $48 million contract with a simple yet weighty note. Celeste Morgan is being illegally detained. Cynthia's team is nearby. Act immediately. Jack's heart tightened. He shot out of his chair, his phone slipping from his hand, slamming onto the table with a dull thud. The executives around him turned to look, but Jack didn't care. The only image in his head was the opening speech for the Fresh Flight campaign, the campaign to rebuild Horizon Air's image through food, with Celeste Morgan at its center. They had shot behind-the-scenes footage at her farm. They had crafted promotional scripts with the slogan, "Real food at real altitude." The press was preparing a feature titled, "The Woman Who Feeds America from the Earth," and an interview video with her was in post-production. And now, that woman was being held by a boarding agent for a gut feeling. Jack dialed Cynthia Reyes, but the call didn't need to connect. In New York, Cynthia had already thrown the quarterly plan draft aside, shoved her internal phone into her bag, slipped on her heels, and rushed out of the office with no time for questions. "I need Sean and Elise from legal right now. Not immediately. Right now," Cynthia said loudly to her assistant. "What's going on, Cynthia?" "A gate agent just detained the wrong person. Not just any passenger, the cornerstone of our new contract, the face of the entire company's food overhaul, the person whose name we should be printing on every first-class meal tray." Cynthia hurried down the glass hallway on the top floor of JFK Airport, overlooking the runway. She had never seen a situation this absurd, a system proud of its internal reform, just signed with the symbol of sustainability and humanity, yet it had shot itself in the foot with a biased glance. Back at Gate 17, while Celeste still stood calmly like an unspoken pillar amidst the growing wave of prejudice from the whispers behind her, Mia, the other boarding agent, had already pieced the facts together. She reopened the internal vendor list, scrolling down to Premium Fresh Contract Q1 and Q2, and the name Morgan Fresh Systems gleamed under the code HZN/2024FF-03. The words Exec Representative Celeste. Morgan almost made her choke. Mia turned to Haley, her eyes full of tension. "Do you know who you're holding out there?" "A passenger needing to be checked. Why?" "Not a passenger. That's the CEO of Morgan Fresh, the company we just signed the contract with to supply all first-class meals for the next 2 quarters. You're holding the wrong person." Haley froze. She stared at the screen, then glanced at Celeste, still standing there as if waiting for an apology from a system she had once believed had changed. In Haley's mind, a flood of questions rushed through. How is she the CEO? Why wasn't I notified? Is this real? Did I make a mistake? The truth, as always, didn't need much noise. It just needed to come at the right moment. And that moment was when Cynthia Reyes appeared. The sound of high heels echoed steadily on the marble floor. The red suit stood out in the bright hallway. She wasn't alone. Behind her was Justin Cole, the legal representative for the Eastern region, and a senior coordinator updating data through his earpiece. Haley immediately stiffened. Mia stepped back. Cynthia didn't need to ask who Celeste Morgan was. Her gaze went directly to the woman standing next to the security guard, her posture calm and steady. No name tag, no sign. There are some people, when they stand in a place, power naturally forms around them. Cynthia walked up and extended her hand. "Miss Morgan, I'm Cynthia Reyes, Northeast Regional Director for Horizon. I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. I'd like to invite you to a private waiting room to discuss this matter." Celeste looked at her, slowly putting her phone into her bag, and nodded. "Do you know what seat I was assigned?" 1A, Cynthia replied without hesitation. "How interesting," Celeste said, a slight smile curling on her lips like a cold blade. "Because someone just told me this lane was only for premium passengers." No one spoke. No need to. Because sometimes the mistake doesn't come from policy. It comes from a look. And the wrong look, in the hands of someone without knowledge, is a knife that cuts through a multi-million-dollar contract. Justin Cole stepped forward, about to speak, but Celeste raised her hand. "I don't need an apology, Mr. Cole. I need an explanation about how an airline that just signed a contract with me can treat me like an intruder." No one could answer right away, because what Celeste needed wasn't words, it was an acknowledgement. And in that moment, Horizon truly felt that they were standing on the brink of a crisis. Haley Dorsey stood behind the counter, her hands tightly clasped together, her knuckles turning white. Every word Celeste Morgan spoke echoed in her mind like an alarm bell, resonating through the empty corridor. They just told me this lane is for premium passengers. She could no longer hear anything else. All the surrounding noise, the announcements at the neighboring gate, the wheels of suitcases rumbling, the internal broadcasted messages, faded into the background. All that remained was the reality. She had just stopped the wrong person. But not just any person. The one holding a $48 million contract with her company. And now, that mistake couldn't be hidden anymore. "Do you know who you just stopped?" Mia whispered for the second time, her voice now sharper, both a warning and a reprimand. Haley didn't answer. She just nodded mechanically. In her mind, everything was spinning. The internal messages about strict procedures, the training sessions emphasizing safety first, the supervisor's words about assessing risks from the first glance. The look. It was that. The look she used to judge Celeste Morgan instead of scanning the ticket. The look that was now turning back to judge her. Haley took a step back, but it felt like her every footstep was nailed to the ground by the stares pouring in from behind. The crowd had gathered more. Some pretended to scroll on their phones. Others turned their cameras toward the boarding gate, all drawn into an event they didn't yet fully understand, but could sense was something significant. "If I let her on now," Haley mumbled, "everyone will know I made a mistake." Mia turned her face away, silent. She knew that the worst part of this situation wasn't that Haley was wrong. It was that Haley was trying to salvage her own image while the system was falling apart piece by piece. On the other side of the glass, where the large windows overlooked the runway, Celeste and Cynthia were still exchanging words in low tones. No one could hear their conversation, but just by observing their body language, it was clear this was no longer a customer service issue. It was an emergency meeting between the two sides of the contract. Inside the legal department, Justin Cole had begun updating the crisis management team through Horizon's internal system. The issue is no longer just about the boarding agent's failure to follow procedure. It's about the agent's behavior showing signs of bias. The contract is at risk. The media might get wind of this. In Minneapolis, Jack Renault read the internal message from Cynthia. She's calm, but she's not here for an apology. The words hit like a dull knife, cutting through Horizon's brand skin. No blood, but a dull ache. Back at Gate 17, Haley looked over at Celeste. The woman wasn't tall or imposing like the CEO she'd seen online, but there was something about Celeste that made no one dare to speak out of turn. It was the way she stood still, not intimidated, even with the security guard beside her. It was her gaze, unwavering, not seeking approval, simply looking. And that gaze made Haley feel smaller with each breath. Not because she was being yelled at, but because she wasn't. Not because she was being scolded, but because she was being looked at directly, at the very thing she had refused to acknowledge: prejudice. That was what caused Haley's breakdown. She couldn't say, "I was just following procedure," because the truth was, Celeste Morgan had done everything right. And it was she, the one following procedure, who had made it all wrong. At that moment, Celeste quietly opened her leather bag. She pulled out a cream-colored folder, simple but sturdy. Inside was the original contract Morgan Fresh had signed with Horizon Air. White paper, black ink, the signatures of 3 executives still clearly visible. She didn't wave her hand. She didn't slam the folder on the table. She simply handed it to Cynthia with both hands, calmly. "I don't need a tweet. I don't need a public apology letter. I need something better," Celeste said, her voice soft but firm. "Because the next person you treat like an intruder might not have the regional director's number, and they won't be carrying a multi-million-dollar contract." Haley didn't hear the full conversation, but she saw something unmistakable. Cynthia, the woman who always stood straight in every meeting, slightly bowed her head, just a little, but enough to understand who truly held the power. In the first-class cabin of the flight waiting to board, the flight attendants were notified. "VIP guest, CEO of Morgan Fresh, is boarding. Provide maximum assistance. No unnecessary communication." Jordan, the head flight attendant, placed his hand on a bottle of silver-capped water, adjusted the tablecloth on seat 1A, and then looked toward the airplane door. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but one thing was certain: Someone had just stopped a woman whom the entire system wouldn't dare to name for a long time. Celeste Morgan said nothing. She simply stood there, her posture straight as a pillar, her back unbowed despite the murmurs from the crowd behind her. She didn't speak, even as every gaze, curious, judgmental, pitying, was directed at her. She didn't react when a woman in a business suit walked past and shook her head, as though witnessing an unnecessary mess. Celeste's gaze didn't look at them. She looked through the thick glass of the airport, where luggage carts rumbled under the early morning sunlight. From that height, everything appeared smaller, and in that smallness she saw the version of herself from the past. Once, Celeste had attended a shareholders' meeting as the newly selected supplier. But as soon as she entered the elegant conference room filled with men in light-colored suits, a female receptionist hurried over, extended her hand, and asked, "Are you here to clean the tables or fetch the documents?" She didn't answer. She simply took the invitation letter from her bag, placed it on the table, and sat down in the front seat, her back straight. Another time, she went to a luxury car showroom in Houston to look at a hybrid model for the new delivery route. A saleswoman, her hair slicked back, voice sweet as honey, looked Celeste up and down and then half smiled. "You probably want to check out the used cars in the back. This model is typically for big corporations." Celeste just smiled lightly. "Good, I am a big corporation." And she turned away. No need to buy a car there, no need to argue. Because for her, power wasn't about shouting. It was about knowing who you were, and not needing anyone's permission to be that person. And today, at Gate 17 of JFK, the same thing happened. But this time, there was one difference. She was no longer the one enduring prejudice. She was the one who could make the whole system take a hard look at itself. When Cynthia Reyes extended her hand, inviting her to board with more humility than ever before, and when Justin Cole, the legal representative of Horizon, bowed his head in apology on behalf of the entire airline, Celeste didn't say a word about their mistake. Because what she needed them to understand wasn't the mistake, it was the root cause. "Miss Morgan, please proceed. The crew has been informed," Cynthia said, her voice softer now, stepping aside as if clearing the way. Celeste nodded lightly, her gaze showing no pride, but also no hint of forgiveness. She simply moved forward, as someone who knew the path she was walking was straight, even if it had just been wrongly blocked. Under the white lights of the airplane entrance, Chief Flight Attendant Jordan stood waiting. He gave a slight bow, opening the cabin door with a gesture of respect unlike any other passenger before. "Welcome, Miss Morgan. If you need anything before takeoff, please let us know," Jordan said quietly, almost as an apology through action. Celeste didn't reply. She just nodded, handed him her leather bag, and stepped into the first-class cabin. Seat 1A was still there, the leather clean, the fold-up table neatly arranged, a bottle of mineral water waiting beside it, with a pristine white napkin. She sat down, adjusted the neck pillow slightly, and didn't look around to find anyone's gaze. No need, because every gaze had already turned toward her. Outside, Haley Dorsey stood frozen behind the counter, her face pale. Mia, her colleague, who had remained silent up until now, whispered, triggering the final realization. That's the woman feeding the entire first-class cabin with fresh vegetables from the farm, the one chosen as the face of the Fresh Flight campaign. And you just tried to stop her from boarding, because you had a feeling she didn't belong? Haley opened her mouth as if to explain, but this time no words came out. No one was stopping her from speaking, but she knew any excuses now would be cheaper than the truth. On the plane, Jordan turned back toward Celeste with one final remark. saw your speech at the conference last year. My younger brother studies agriculture, and after hearing you speak, he decided to quit his office job to work on a farm. Thank you for making everything real." For the first time since leaving the boarding counter, Celeste smiled slightly, not widely, but genuinely. "Well, then he started heading in the right direction," she replied. Then she turned her head toward the window, where the early sunlight was glinting off the wing, shimmering like the last rays of a storm. She didn't need to shout for anyone to listen. Because when a woman dares to stand still in the face of prejudice, a whole system will have to step back to see itself. Celeste's final words still echoed in Cynthia Reyes' mind as they walked through the private boarding lane, the fluorescent lights stretching ahead like a narrow corridor leading to a system waiting for a fix. "Funny, I was told this isn't the area for me." She didn't raise her voice, nor was she harsh, but each word struck coldly at the very identity of the entire Horizon Air structure. Cynthia, who had handled the biggest crisis of the decade, who had restructured the entire Northeast personnel network after an internal scandal, had never felt smaller than she did at this moment. She didn't respond to Celeste, not because she couldn't, but because any words now would only be excuses. So she remained silent, a slight bow of her head, a gesture so quiet, yet holding an undeniable admission. "We are wrong, and you don't need to prove anything further." When Celeste sat in seat 1A, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin seemed to deflate, as if something had just shifted. Indistinct, but undeniably real. The flight attendants, from Jordan to the beverage manager, were more cautious than usual, not out of fear, but because they knew that a weighty silence had just been established in this cabin. Celeste asked for nothing. No water, no table opened. She simply sat, her hands gently folded in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window where the light was beginning to spread across JFK's runway. At the same time, in Horizon's urgent meeting room on the 10th floor of the airport, Cynthia was coordinating a critical review. The heads of human resources, legal, and internal communications were all present. Justin Cole, who had just followed Celeste onto the plane, had returned, removing his name tag as if it were heavy. "We can't wait for the media to find out," Cynthia said firmly. "I need a list of all employees directly involved in this incident, the internal communications script, and a formal report on the steps taken before the plane took off." "And if Celeste Morgan posts something?" a member of the team asked. Cynthia shook her head, almost laughing bitterly. "She doesn't need to post. All it takes is for one passenger in the waiting area to capture that moment and upload it. Everything will spread on its own." And, as predicted, on an anonymous Twitter account, the first tweet appeared with an image. The woman blocked at gate 17. No shouting, no arguments. But when she pulled out her phone, the whole system shook. Hashtags began to appear. $, gate 17, $, silent power, $, fresh flight, fail. In Minneapolis, Jack Renault read that tweet, his lips pressed tight. There were no images of Celeste shouting, no shocking videos, but that's exactly why the story spread faster. "We can't control this story," Jack said into the phone when he called Cynthia, "but we can control how we respond." Cynthia replied succinctly, "I know, and I also know Mrs. Morgan doesn't want an apology." What does she want? She wants that next time. If someone like her is at the counter, we don't leave them standing there silent. In the first-class cabin, Celeste closed her eyes, not because she was tired, but because she needed a moment of quiet to shake off the repetition of the memory. She remembered her first day delivering to Horizon. She had been the one to drive the small truck carrying rainbow chard and summer cherry tomatoes, both fresh and fragile, to the company's test kitchen. She had once thought that once she became economically valuable, the prejudices would disappear. But the harsh reality showed her that prejudice doesn't vanish, it only hides, waiting for the moment of weakness to resurface. A flight attendant silently approached her. "Mrs. Morgan, we have prepared a special meal for you. It's a set made with ingredients supplied by your own system." Celeste opened her eyes and gently shook her head. "I'm not hungry. Don't do anything to make up for it. Let things be as they should be." The flight attendant bowed her head, understanding. No words were spoken. Outside, 3 Horizon gates next to Gate 17 suddenly showed the status: delayed, internal reason. No explanation was given, but within the internal system the order to halt all boarding activities had been activated. Cynthia had made her decision. "We can't let this happen again. Not until we know how many Haleys are holding the gates with that small yet destructive power." And as Celeste Morgan sat in seat 1A, her gaze slightly turned toward the cloud streaks outside the window, she knew. Her silence had done something that even hundreds of speeches might not have achieved. The morning sunlight still crept through the 1A window, quietly falling on Celeste Morgan's hand, where an ivory envelope was pulled out with determination, neither rushed nor flashy. She placed it on the folding table before her, not facing anyone in particular, but clearly leaving it where anyone who needed to see would see. Cynthia Reyes, who was still standing a few steps away, not yet ready to leave the plane, paused for a moment. This was not an act of challenge, not a counterattack. It was an indictment written with precision, resilience, and no unnecessary emotion. Celeste gently opened the envelope and pulled out a copy of the official contract signed with Horizon Air less than 2 months ago. Bold print, the company logo, internal codes, and 3 clear signatures at the end. Celeste Morgan, CEO of Morgan Fresh Systems Jack Renault, Horizon Food Director Sean Bell, Midwest Legal Advisor. She slid the copy toward Cynthia, not speaking immediately, letting the silence amplify the weight of what was about to be said. "This is the original contract," Celeste said, her voice low, not angry, but heavy enough that every syllable fell like a stone on the metal table. "Your first-class meals, those are from me. The VIP lounge you're advertising, that's from me. The food system Horizon uses to salvage its image after the frozen food scandal, that's from me." Cynthia took the paper, her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear of Celeste, but from seeing the mirror reflecting the very actions of her own system. "And today," Celeste continued, "the one deemed a security threat, the one held without reason, the one scrutinized simply because they weren't to your liking, is the same brand you are carrying in every tray of food on this flight." Her tone neither rose nor fell, but the entire first class could hear each word clearly. Jordan, the head flight attendant, stood nearby, neither speaking nor bowing his head, but standing tall, like someone witnessing the truth being placed in its rightful place. A passenger in seat 1C, a man in a gray suit with a gold ring on his left hand, probably a lawyer, gave a slight nod after hearing that. He didn't speak, but his gaze confirmed. This was a lesson that couldn't be ignored. Celeste didn't stop there. She pulled another handwritten note from the envelope. It contained only a brief line. "No need for an apology. Clean up your system before talking about corporate culture." She placed the note neatly next to the contract copy and looked directly at Cynthia. "I don't need a handwritten letter, and I don't need a tweet from PR. I want action. And action doesn't start with hashtags. It starts with real personnel being reassessed." Cynthia seemed lost for words. She didn't expect Celeste, who was always described as humble, gentle in all partner records, to be so composed, so clear, and so sharp. "I understand," Cynthia said softly. "Good," Celeste replied simply, "because the next person who doesn't have a contract in their pocket won't have the right to reclaim respect. And that person could be my daughter, or any passenger you make feel small with the ticket they paid for." At that moment, the internal system at Horizon was on high alert. Human Resources, starting to check all violation histories from JFK boarding gates. Communications, halting the fresh flight campaign until a specific crisis management plan is in place. Legal, preparing an update for the anti-bias enforcement for frontline staff policy, expected to be implemented within 48 hours. Justin Cole, who had just returned to the cabin after receiving the report from Cynthia, quietly observed Celeste, who was now folding the documents and placing them back in her leather bag. He knew this was not just a reminder, it was a warning. She doesn't need to threaten with the media. She just places a contract in the right spot, and a power structure has to re-examine itself. Celeste gently leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. Not out of fatigue, but because she knew the power game had ended, but the consequences had only just begun. The boarding door in front of the first-class cabin opened once more, this time for two men in dark suits, entering with tense faces, still unable to conceal their shock. Jack Renault, the chief of food and customer experience at Horizon Air, still held a file, temporarily clipped together with a paperclip. Walking alongside him was Justin Cole, the Northeast legal advisor, his leather briefcase still slightly open, almost as though they had left the emergency meeting without properly closing it. They didn't wait for introductions. Both of them walked straight up to seat 1A, where Celeste Morgan was still sitting, arms crossed in front of her chest, her gaze unwavering. "Miss Morgan," Jack spoke first, his voice urgent, "I am so sorry about this unacceptable incident. I can't imagine this happening to you. We will do everything we can to—" "I don't need an apology," Celeste interrupted, her voice steady, not louder than a whisper, but enough to make both men stop dead in their tracks. "I need you to change the way you look at people. I need you to stop using procedures to justify prejudice." Justin Cole, who had spent hundreds of hours presenting on equality policies, who had approved numerous anti-discrimination commitments, now stood silently. Not because he had nothing to say, but because there was nothing worth responding to. Celeste turned her gaze toward him, not with malice, but with something deeper than disappointment. "You've written enough campaigns, posted enough slogans, hung enough banners for diversity and inclusion. But when a black woman stands in front of your staff with a first-class ticket, they still choose to doubt instead of scan the code. That's not in the documents," she emphasized. "It's in the minds of the people." Cynthia Reyes, standing behind, didn't intervene anymore. She only bowed her head, the first time in her career, to a partner. Not to appease, but to acknowledge. After a few seconds, no one said anything more. The exchange wasn't long. But everyone present understood. No apology could replace action. No compensation could cover the invisible harm of being looked at with suspicion because of race, gender, or age. Cynthia took a deep breath and gave a silent signal to the staff to reopen the boarding door. The flight to San Francisco, which was supposed to have taken off 27 minutes ago, still hadn't moved. But now, no one on Horizon's team was rushing. Because the biggest delay wasn't on the runway, it was in the minds of those who needed to change. The door closed. Jack and Justin left. No more promises, no more business cards offered. Just silence, heavier than any well-prepared apology speeches. At that moment, Jordan, the head flight attendant, approached and leaned slightly toward Celeste. "Ms. Morgan," he spoke quietly, "I just want to thank you, not for the contract, but for not bowing to them. That's what I always wished my mother could do, the day she was stopped at the bank just for wearing flip-flops. Celeste looked at him. In the eyes of this young man, she saw a forgotten piece of childhood, an old wound that had once gone unanswered. She didn't need to say anything. Just a slight nod, enough to bridge a gap between two people who had lived at opposite ends of life, but both scarred by the same cut. Judgment based on the first glance. Meanwhile, at the 3 adjacent boarding gates near Gate 17, Horizon flights began to display delay notices. Delayed due to internal operational reasons. Awaiting passenger verification. Reconfirming boarding procedures. No one outside the company knew that the true reason was that Horizon had just ordered a halt to boarding across the entire Northeast region to audit the behavior of frontline employees. A silent audit had been initiated, without public announcement, but affecting the entire flight schedule for 3 hours. And it all started with a phone call. A wrong look. A silence at the right moment. Celeste Morgan leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closed. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel victory. She only felt it was time to rebuild, from the ground up, from those who never thought they needed to learn how to look at people. Celeste Morgan sat in seat 1A, the familiar seat that had been assigned to her when she booked her ticket. No one mentioned it was a premium seat. No one mentioned priority privileges. No one needed to, because they all had already seen who was truly worthy of sitting here. Jordan, the head flight attendant, didn't speak. He carefully took Celeste's leather bag, fastened the strap, and placed it respectfully at her feet. Then he opened a bottle of mineral water, poured it into a small silver-rimmed glass, and placed it on the folding tray. He didn't ask, "What would you like?" He simply said quietly, "If you need anything, just let me know." Celeste only nodded slightly, neither thanking nor refusing. Her hands gently folded in front of her stomach. Her back rested against the soft leather seat, but she didn't lean back. Her gaze still directed out the window, where the early sunlight swept across the runway as if time was trying to wipe away a silent memory. She didn't touch the glass of water, didn't take out her phone. She simply looked. Across the cabin, other first-class passengers began to take notice. Some pretended to adjust their watches. Some suddenly changed seats to enjoy the view on the left. But everyone knew their minds weren't on the weather or the airplane wing. They were watching Celeste, and they were thinking. The man in seat 1C, a lawyer, clicked his tongue softly, then opened his iPad but didn't really read anything. A middle-aged woman in designer glasses, seated in 2A, glanced at Celeste twice, then pulled the blanket over her lap without saying a word. No one asked anything. No one apologized. But Celeste didn't need them to, because that silence, even if awkward, was a form of acknowledgement. From the back of the cabin, a young flight attendant, perhaps in her early 20s, came over, holding a small tray with a handwritten card and a silver-wrapped chocolate bar. She placed it in front of Celeste, then whispered, her eyes shining with embarrassment, "From me and a few people in the crew. We don't know what happened earlier, but we know something was wrong. We just wanted you to know not everyone turned a blind eye." Celeste turned to look at the young woman, not smiling, not moved. But her gaze softened, and in that moment, the young flight attendant knew she had just said what needed to be said. On the handwritten card was a short message. "Thank you for not staying silent. Because of you, we know when to stand up." Celeste lightly touched the edge of the card, not picking it up. Just left it there, as if to let someone else see it, and wonder why someone would need to thank a person just for standing still. At that same moment, at Horizon's office in JFK, Cynthia Reyes was meeting with the crisis management team. On the screen was a notification from the internal system. Flight 488, JFK to SFO, is 38 minutes delayed. Reason: suspension of priority passenger verification. No one in the room dared to ask for details. Cynthia stood before the electronic board, her gaze tired but resolute. We don't fix mistakes by speed. We fix mistakes by starting to look directly at what we've been unwilling to see. A member of the communications team asked quietly, "Do you think Ms. Morgan will make this public?" Cynthia didn't respond immediately. She recalled Celeste's eyes when she said, "I don't need an apology. I need action." After a few seconds, she simply replied, "She doesn't need to make it public. Those who witnessed it will tell the story for her." And just as Cynthia had predicted, in the airport lounge, a passenger posted on Reddit a detailed account from Gate to 17, along with the description, "I didn't know who she was at first. I just saw a black woman in a suit being stopped while holding a first-class ticket. But then, when she made a phone call, the whole airport seemed to freeze. No anger, no tears, but after that call, not a single employee dared to speak." The post began to be shared, not loudly, not with clickbait. Just a story that spread gradually in the right communities, where the value of calmness was understood and the consequences of implicit bias were clear. On the plane, the engines started. The wings began to roll. Celeste closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. She remembered the first time she was turned away from a flower shop as a young girl buying a carnation bouquet for her mother. She remembered submitting a bidding proposal and being handed a job application instead of the invitation for the tender. And now, she recalled Haley's eyes when she pulled the contract out of her leather bag, not with anger, not with joy, but with the truth, bare and unavoided. That is true power. No need to shout, no need to be heard, just being right, and letting that correctness spread like a smoldering fire beneath the ice. As Horizon Air's plane rolled away from the JFK runway, there was no applause, no camera flashes, no one cheering. The delayed flight has taken off. Because everyone felt that they were not just witnesses to a flight. They had crossed a boundary, where silence became the most powerful strike. On the airport's operational system, 5 Horizon flights were delayed simultaneously, with no clear reasons. The notifications were vague. Delayed due to internal personnel coordination. Waiting for frontline verification. Processing priority passenger procedures. The whispers began in the waiting area. A cleaning staff member clicked his tongue. "Something's going on. I heard they're urgently calling the department heads to the 6th floor." One passenger whispered to a friend, "I heard someone was stopped because they didn't look like a first-class passenger." And it turns out that person is the CEO of the company supplying food for all of Horizon. Wow, they picked the wrong person. Picked the wrong person and the wrong time. No official statement was issued, but the entire airport seemed to freeze. At Horizon Air's internal office on the 10th floor of JFK Airport, all employees involved with Gate 17 were temporarily removed from the floor without public notice. No firings were signed immediately, but all eyes were now on something that had never been seriously questioned. Who defines suitable for first class? And how many people have been excluded from their seats, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't fit someone else's imagination? Haley Dorsey, the one who had refused to scan Celeste's ticket, no longer saw her name on the schedule for the next morning. She left the check-in area in silence, without anyone escorting her. But the eyes of those who had stood beside her that day now avoided hers. Not because they didn't know, but because they knew too well. Mia, the only colleague who had tried to warn Haley, remained. But she sat quietly in the corner of the meeting room, where internal checklists were being printed, her fingers gently tapping on a cold coffee cup. A colleague whispered, "Is this really that big of a deal?" Mia didn't answer. She only whispered, "There are some people who don't need to shout, but when they stand still, the whole airport has to hold its breath." Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Horizon Flight 488 gently landed. Celeste Morgan didn't rush to leave her seat, while passengers around her quickly gathered their luggage, opened their phones, called their drivers, and sent messages. She remained seated, hands resting on her lap, her body still. She didn't need to hurry, because the biggest victory of the day she had already won. When she stepped off the plane, no one stopped her. No one checked her ticket. No one asked for her identity. Only the gaze, full of respect, full of understanding, from Jordan and the flight attendants, and a small gesture from the pilot. A low nod, not because of rank, but because of the truth. Celeste walked into the arrivals area. A driver was waiting with a sign that read, "C. Morgan, Morgan Fresh Systems." When she sat in the back seat of the black Lincoln, her phone began to buzz. A chain of notifications. Email from Cynthia Reyes. "We are conducting a full review of our customer access policies." Text from Maggie. "You've done what the entire DEI campaign never touched. They're rewriting the entire SOP." Link to a blog post from a local newspaper. Black CEO stopped at airport. Her silence shakes the system. Celeste didn't open the post. She didn't need to know what they were writing, because she knew what needed to be said she had already said, not with her mouth, but with her actions. At the Marriott Hotel, where the Western Food Sustainability Summit was taking place, the conference room was almost full. A few people had heard the rumors. A few were speaking quietly. Celeste Morgan is coming. "I heard she's the one who was stopped at JFK this morning." "Is that true? I heard Horizon is halting all operations in the Northeast because of that." When Celeste entered from the side of the hall, no one stood up. No one clapped. But the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. She walked slowly, head held high, the light shining gently on her gray jacket and the metal leaf-shaped pin, the logo of Morgan Fresh Systems. No one introduced her. No one needed to. Because she had just entered as a living symbol of resilience at the perfect moment. And when the coordinator took the microphone, nervously introducing her name and inviting her to the stage with a worried smile, Celeste simply nodded, took the microphone, and spoke in a confident tone. "I'm not going to talk about what happened this morning. I'm going to talk about what made it possible to happen, and what we, those of us in food, in systems, in running the economy, need to do differently." Celeste Morgan stood before the microphone in the Marriott Conference Hall, where the Western Food Sustainability Summit was taking place, as if she had never been stopped at the airport gate earlier that morning. No traces of injury, no expression of anger, just a steady stance, her gaze sweeping across the front row, where distributors, agricultural CEOs, major supermarket chain directors, and airline executives were sitting silently, focused. No one asked about JFK, not a single question. "We've heard about it." Not a murmur. "Is that her?" But Celeste knew, they knew, everyone knew. She began her speech not with a grand greeting, but with a story about beets. 18 months ago, a small farm in Kansas of mine nearly lost the entire harvest. Why? An email was missed, a warehouse operator was on leave, and the replacement wasn't sure the shipment was necessary. A small decision, seemingly harmless, nearly left the entire Southwest product chain without supply for nearly 2 weeks. Everyone paid attention. Some began taking notes. We often blame the system, the software, the supervisor, but sometimes the problem doesn't come from the system. It comes from hasty judgments about people. The room seemed to freeze. Her words weren't loud, but every gaze suddenly stopped, as if each person had subconsciously re-examined how they, managers and staff alike, had been viewing others. Celeste paused for a beat, then continued. You can have a 5-step check procedure. You can use AI to analyze customer behavior. You can place QR codes on every box of vegetables. But if one of your employees looks at a customer and decides, this person can't be a VIP just because of the shoes they're wearing, then you don't have a supply chain. You have prejudice packaged and shipped. The whole room went silent. No one laughed, no one gasped. There was only a silence building up like water about to overflow. She continued, I don't care how much you've spent on marketing. I want to know, who gets to decide to reject a person, and on what basis? This time, a member of the organizing committee, pale-faced, leaned back in his chair. A CEO of a retail chain lowered his head, adjusted his collar, without looking up. I've been denied entry to a conference because I didn't look like a founder. I've been asked to go to the back gate after securing $1 million contract because the guard thought I was the delivery person. And this morning, a woman like me had to present ID, a contract, and even my reputation, just to cross a line I helped build myself. No one needed more evidence, because no one in that room was unaware of what had just happened. Celeste paused, slightly lowered her head, and concluded, we can optimize storage time. We can shorten order processing cycles, but don't shorten the time it takes to assess a person. Because that's where decay begins, not in the vegetable crate, but in the gaze. The applause came slowly, not enthusiastically, not uniformly, but from small groups, from those who understood, from those who had once judged wrongly, and from those who would never dare judge hastily again. After stepping off the stage, Celeste was walking down the hall beside the conference room when a man, wearing an olive suit, graying hair, with a badge reading Logistics Lead, Pacific Retail Group, approached her. He didn't speak immediately. He just walked alongside for a moment before softly saying, the line about shortening the evaluation of a person will make me see my employees differently. Celeste simply smiled, without turning back. That's enough, she whispered. That's why I stood there. And she continued walking, without the glow of fame, without any cameras, only with the truth as a silent weapon that couldn't be denied. When Celeste Morgan left the Marriott conference after her speech, she did so as quietly and confidently as when she had entered. No press conference followed, no tweet, no LinkedIn post. And when a reporter from Business Equity Weekly approached her for an exclusive interview, Celeste simply shook her head. I came here to talk about the food supply chain, not to recount a story about an airport. Another offer came from a national television network, inviting her to join a live panel discussion on unconscious bias in the airline industry. Celeste responded with a single line. Silence doesn't mean inaction, but not every struggle needs to be broadcasted. And so, no one was publicly criticized. No one was named or shamed in the press. No legal threats were sent from Morgan Fresh Systems' office. But Horizon Air began to change from within, and no one dared to call it coincidence. 1 week after the incident at JFK, Horizon quietly announced a new partnership with the civil rights organization Equity Now, a group specializing in providing strategic advisory to businesses on racial equity, covertly monitoring discriminatory behavior, and restructuring personnel processes. The announcement was made via an internal newsletter, not through major media outlets. but those who followed industry insider news understood. This was an apology. Unspoken, but with action. In the following 3 months, all frontline personnel at Horizon were required to attend a retraining course on unconscious bias recognition and nonverbal assessments. Horizon's HR department began logging feedback regarding invalid customer control processes as a Level 2 internal violation. The company officially included cultural engagement, KPIs, not just productivity. And most importantly, Gate 17 at JFK, the place where the shockwave began, was temporarily suspended for process re-engineering. No one mentioned Celeste Morgan's name in the news, but every employee who worked that shift that day knew why they had to sit in a meeting for 5 hours, reviewing camera footage and listening to internal recordings. In a small kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, where the faded tin roof and a wall clock that ran 4 minutes behind were the only decor, Louise Morgan was reading an article from a business analysis magazine. The Silent Impact of Celeste Morgan, a CEO who made the entire system rethink, not by law, but by values. Louise set the article down on the old dining table, where Celeste had once sat studying math at age 12. Illuminated only by the flickering yellow light from the overhead lamp. She smiled softly, no display. Then muttered to herself, but also to the next generation. "That's my daughter. She's never had to yell to be heard." Meanwhile, in an internal meeting at another airline, Horizon's competitor, the HR director presented a slide with an image of Celeste standing before the conference, quoting her words. "Don't shorten the time to assess a person, because that's where decay begins, not in the vegetable crate, but in the gaze." Someone in the room asked, "Which book is this from?" The team leader replied, "No. This isn't theory, this is reality, and if we don't learn from it, we'll be the next ones needing to apologize." Celeste continued her daily work at Morgan Fresh Systems. The contract with Horizon was still in motion. Shipments of kale, melons, and pumpkins were regularly leaving the Midwest farm for distribution centers. No articles were posted on the company's website about the incident. No moral victory banners, no PR messages. But in the office on the 3rd floor, where Celeste hung photos from the old vegetable stand instead of awards, a new card was pinned to the corner of the wooden board. From an anonymous passenger, handwritten, "I watched you say nothing, but the whole airport had to stop. Thank you for teaching me. Sometimes the most effective resistance is refusing to be dragged down to the level of those who look down on you." A person who once thought they understood first class, and now doesn't dare to think so anymore. Celeste read it, folded the card, then returned to the winter goods rotation plan on the board. She didn't need applause. She didn't need anyone shouting for justice. She just needed to keep doing what was right and let the silence do the rest. In a world where people often judge others by their appearance or the seat they choose on a plane, Celeste Morgan reminded us of one thing. True power isn't in loud words. It's in the right action at the right moment. No need to shout, no need for lawsuits. Just stand still and make the entire system look back at itself. So, what about you? Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly just because they didn't look like they belonged? Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes change begins with stories like these. If you think this story deserves to be shared, please like, share with friends, and subscribe to the channel to hear more real, impactful, and inspiring stories from around the world. See you in the next journey.